Hello and welcome, you lovely internet people. I am Josh Rivers, and I want to talk about Pyre. Pyre is the latest game to come from Supergiant, and it's a game that for a while I wasn't entirely sure what to think of. After having sunk a few more hours into it, I've come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's pretty good. And evidently, at the very least, it's certainly interesting enough that I wanted to do a video on it. So without further ado, I'd probably better explain what the game actually is. The player assumes the role of an unnamed protagonist exiled from a fantasy dystopia called the Commonwealth for the heinous crime of literacy. Commonwealth officials having apparently outlawed all knowledge that would equip its citizenry to start questioning their authority. The protagonist, simply referred to as the Reader, is stumbled upon by another group of exiles in a stagecoach who just so happen to have a book that needs reading. The book turns out to be pretty bloody important, as it reveals that there is a way to return from your otherwise permanent exile and regain your freedom. And that singular path towards your liberation is to play 3-on-3 basketball? Is that right? Is someone having a laugh? Are you having a bubbly bath, sunshine? Yes, this is what comprises the bulk of the gameplay, and thank God I'm talking about this in a format where I can use visual aids, because otherwise it's a bit of a bugger to explain. You have two pyres, hence the name, on either side of the field, two teams of 3, and an orb. Your goal is to get the orb into the opponent's pyre. The pyres themselves have HP, and when that reaches 0, the pyre is extinguished. The first team to extinguish their opponent's pyre wins the match. Or, as the mysterious and magnificently performed voice that presides over the ceremony puts it,
"Whose ever pyre yet burns ere the break of dawn shall surge forward on the path to glory."
My God, that voice though. Anyway, that's the basic structure of the game. Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Each member of your triumvirate also has an aura surrounding them which can be used to banish opposing players, temporarily removing them from the field. This aura can also be used as a projectile to banish opponents from a distance. Characters are also banished after they score a goal, making them unusable until another goal is scored. This puts the scoring team at a slight disadvantage and makes sure you're actually using all of the teammates rather than just relying on one in order to get everything done. It's a bit like rubber banding, but with actual tactical depth. You can avoid that banishment by throwing the orb into the fire instead of walking it in, but the throw takes ages to charge and it seems to do less damage, so I never really bothered. There's lots of different characters you get introduced to throughout the game, and they all have different stats governing the size of their auras, how much damage they'll do to the pyre, etc, etc. You can run, you can jump, you can be a little worm, a little wiggly worm, ooh. But all of that's preamble, because there's one mechanic in particular that I wanted to talk about. And now that I'm done setting up all the context, I can get into talking about the bit that I think might be the cornerstone of why I was so interested in talking about this game. Here's the thing. You may have picked up on this already from just looking at the footage, but you can only move one character at a time. You hit a button to switch to a different teammate, and if you happen to be holding the orb, then this will also pass the orb. This means that the other two teammates are just standing idle wherever you last left them, and they're still generating their auras as they do this, so they sort of generate passive obstacles for the other team. But because they're not moving, they're also really easy for the other team to banish. So not only do you need to be thinking about what you're doing with the character you're controlling, you also need to be keeping an eye on the two characters that you're not. This is especially true in the case of the less manoeuvrable characters, the bigger ones who tend to be slower and take longer to respawn after being banished. Can I afford to let them be banished right now? Are they going to come back by the time I need them? Would I even be able to move them out of the way in time if I did switch to them? Is it worth taking that risk? And in terms of defense, are they stood in the best position? If somebody makes a break for the goal, are my other characters going to be able to get there in time to stop them from where they are are now, or do I need to move them before that happens? Do I want to keep my other two teammates closer together, merging their auras into a bigger defensive barrier, or do I want to spread them out over the whole field to give myself more options when passing the orb? Are the two people who are stood doing nothing in the best place? All that said, it's not like it's an overwhelming amount of information to have to keep track of. It's actually fairly intuitive and fairly simple, once you know that that's what you need to be doing. But as I said at the beginning, I didn't really get it at first. I can appreciate all of the intricacies of it now, but none of it really sunk in until I was already a couple of hours deep. Maybe it's because the three teammates you start out with aren't particularly varied in terms of abilities, and I just needed to unlock a few of the more unique ones in order to get a full grasp on the game. But it's also entirely possible that this is just the price you pay for being original. You look at other more traditional goal-based sports and they're usually quite fast-paced. So while positioning and strategy still have a role, usually the sheer speed of the thing means that it's going to come down to whoever's got the reflexes and the dexterity. On the surface, Pyre has the same structure as these other games, but its pace is a lot slower, more methodical, and that can often bring it to the point of feeling sluggish if you're expecting it to play like a more traditional sports game. The bigger, heavier characters in particular can move so painfully slowly at times that you're left thinking, well, what possible use is that? And this can lead you to want to comprise your team entirely of the smaller, faster characters just to bring the game up to the speed you're subconsciously expecting. And hey, if that's winning you matches, then it's a valid tactic, and if you're having fun, then it's a perfectly valid way to play. But it feels like kind of a brute force approach in a game that is a lot more about strategy than speed, and unless you're some kind of savant with these faster characters, it's probably going to make the game a lot harder for you than it needed to be. Agility isn't the be-all and end-all that you would expect it to be in a game like this. It doesn't matter how sprinty or jumpy you are, if the other team's got a full roster and they're all hanging out by their Pyre, you're not getting past them. I had to learn that the hard way after a painfully long stalemate with one of the teams in the campaign, and you can pretty much forget about trying to lure opponents out. It doesn't even seem to work on the AI. Unless you're very clearly making a run at their goal, they'll take the opportunity to banish your teammates, and then with no one to pass to, you're pretty much cornered. And bear in mind, I'm describing the AI opponents. The people who designed this game programmed these opponents to play in this way. So you've got to figure that there's something else to it. Let's examine what the AI is doing. Let's look at the tactics that the developers have built into the game as standard. They're not going straight for the ball and then ducking and weaving until they find some sort of opening. They're actively creating openings by removing your teammates from the field. So it stands to reason that that's what you need to be doing. It's not a game about dodging through obstacles. It's about removing the obstacles entirely, clearing a path to the opponent's goal while keeping the path to yours blocked off. And you can't do that when you've got the orb, because your aura disappears. You stop being able to banish anyone. And because switching to another teammate also passes the orb, you lose your one method of attack across the board. So as counterintuitive as it might seem, having the ball actually puts you on the defensive. So instead, what you want to be doing is practicing a bit of patience. Resist that temptation to immediately get possession of the orb, and instead just banish a couple of the opposing players. Get as many of them off of the field at one time as you can, and then once their defensive line's got a ruddy great hole through it, that's when you want to be going for the orb. Once you make that observation, you find a use for the bigger, slower characters, and the game actually becomes a lot more fun. Because while there is something to be said for the tension in trying to anticipate when the inanimate adversary you're trying to bolt past is suddenly going to snap to life, trying to do that when all three opponents are in play can quickly feel like banging your head against a brick wall. And besides which, playing smarter just winds up being more satisfying, because you could start scoring goals using the characters who deal bigger damage. And not just that one dog. It's not perfect. Switching between your teammates on the field can be a bit janky because it's all assigned to the same button. You press it to switch to the teammate closest to you or that you're facing. To be honest, I never really figured it out. Indeed, sometimes it felt like it was just picking the name of the character it was going to switch to out of a hat, and that's not really what you want when someone's bearing down on your goal and you have seconds to react. And it's just made that slightest bit more annoying by the fact that really I don't think this is a problem we should still be having. Real-time cycling between 3 characters is something that we've had down since the PS2 era. I mean, Sonic Heroes did it, for God's sake. Might seem like a bit of a petty complaint in light of the 8 or so minutes I've just spent singing the game's praises, but at the very least you've got to admit that having a second button to switch between teammates would have been more useful than a taunt button, which is in the game, and doesn't really add anything. But that really just amounts to a minor irritation because the game is still fun, the gameplay's engaging, and you feel smart when you do it right. It's a very satisfying game to play, and given that a lot of aspects of it are experimental or at the very least atypical, it's encouraging to see that it came out well, even if it does take a bit of getting used to. Now, so far I've painted a very positive picture of Pyre, perhaps a picture so pleasant that you might be persuaded to pause your perusal of my pontification, perchance to presume Pyre is perfect. But bear in mind, the entirety of the 10 or so minutes I've just done has just been about the core gameplay. And while that's definitely a testament to how good the gameplay is that I can talk about it for that long, it is also important to remember that it comes attached to a whole rest of the campaign. And I do think that's important to bring up, because if you go into the rest of the campaign expecting it to be as fresh and original as the main gameplay, you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed. The story is largely presented in visual novel segments, which are pretty much exactly what you just pictured when I said visual novel segments. They're self-explanatory to the point of barely being worth talking about. Doesn't do anything particularly weird or interesting with that structure, it's basically just there to facilitate the story, which itself would be fine if a lot of the writing weren't also kind of unoriginal in that typical high fantasy way. I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker, it didn't ruin the experience for me, and if you're into your high fantasy stuff you're still probably going to enjoy this. But for a game that had such a unique core concept, the plot really is full of a lot of stuff you've seen before. It stands out visually, that I will give it. It's got a very striking art style, a lot of colour, always nice to see, and I really like the character design. If this was the first fantasy story you had ever seen, I can imagine being absolutely enraptured with it. But if it isn't, and let's be honest, for most players it won't be, then you're gonna realise pretty quickly that under the paint job, it has basically the same structure as every other fantasy story you've seen. It's got all of the tropes that you would expect from that genre, and doesn't really attempt anything interesting with them. If I may be allowed to start heading into spoiler territory, so if you don't want spoilers, you have been warned, the first 3 characters you meet are a perfect example of this. You've got the gentle, kind-hearted one who saves you because he sees something in you that nobody else does. You've got the big, scary one who doesn't trust you at first and was in favour of leaving you to die. And you've got the slightly dubious, wheeler-dealer comic relief character. Later on, you're gonna get the femme fatale, you're gonna get fantasy racism, of course, and you're gonna get the energetic, overzealous character who's constantly shouting about honour. Although I kind of have to let that one slide because, I mean, look at him. Look at him! But that's exactly the thing, they lean on the visual spectacle, and that's a mistake that a lot of high fantasy makes. It's a trap that they all seem to fall into, thinking that the visual distinction alone is going to be enough because, but I bet you've never seen it coming from a dog with a moustache before. And while the effort that's gone into the admittedly impressive visuals might curry a little favour with the audience, it's never going to be enough to change the fact that the writing is so full of heavily established tropes that we know pretty much word for word how every plot thread is going to go. You know that it's going to turn out that the dubious comic relief character owes someone money. You know that the big scary one is going to be confused as to why you're not scared of them and why you consider them a friend even though they never trusted you. And you know that the fantasy racism bit's going to end with the two of them putting aside their differences and having their Legolas and Gimli at the end of Return of the King moment. We see it all coming because we've seen it all a million times before, and it doesn't matter how good your world looks. If the writing supporting that world is predictable, people are gonna get tired of it. But look at him though! Like I said at the outset, it's not like any of it's badly written. Well, I mean, fantasy racism's always badly written, but other than that, it's not like any of it's badly written. We've just seen it all before, it's been done. The idea of literacy having been criminalised is the only novel, pardon the pun, hook the story gets in a really long time. And even then, it doesn't get fleshed out until quite a ways into the story. Because none of the characters you're with at the start talk about reading. They can't read, why would they? In fact, thinking about it now, there's maybe one scene in the whole game where the idea of reading being a rare skill lived up to the narrative potential I was expecting it to have. And beyond that, it's really just the reason your character's important in the story. It's the special main character power. Once again, looks new and interesting, but actually boils down to a very familiar template. And normally I don't think it would bother me this much. There's definitely less original games that I wouldn't rag on for this long. But everything about Pyre's story, its world, its characters, the whole concept of the exile you all share and the rites you're conducting, it's all dripping in potential. And to see most of that potential go unused in favour of treading familiar ground kinda sucks. Now, having said all that, and I do feel the need to keep clarifying this isn't me saying don't play the game, this is me saying temper your expectations. A lot of the critical discussion around the game, particularly the earlier critical discussion before and leading up to the game's release, focused on how interesting the core narrative premise was. And if you go into the game having only heard that, you might come away feeling a little bit underwhelmed. But I would recommend that you stick with it, because round about the halfway point, the campaign changes drastically, becoming something altogether more interesting. But at the same time, I fully appreciate that telling people to sit through half a game's worth of setup just to get to the bit I want them to see is asking a bit much. So let me reiterate that spoiler warning from earlier, because for the people who don't feel like they can justify committing the time, I'm gonna give a brief rundown of the late game. Eventually, and rather inevitably, the subject of revolution comes up, and the plan is when you're all free, you're going to meet up on the other side and overthrow the Commonwealth as peacefully as possible. But it turns out that exiles can only be freed one at a time, so you're going to have to go through this whole rigmarole several times, racking up the wins as each of the other teams gets progressively tougher. You get given a planner that, among other things, shows you a percentage indicating how likely your plan is to succeed, and you've got to use your best judgment to get that percentage as close to 100 as possible. Typically, if you free one of your teammates, the revolution's more likely to succeed. But of course, once they're free, they're gone. You can no longer use them as part of your team. So if one of the characters you think would be a huge benefit to the revolution also happens to be the linchpin of all of your strategies, it can wind up being a very real dilemma. Can the revolution afford for this person to still be trapped here, versus can my team afford for them not to be? And what I really love about that idea is the only effective way to get around the problem is to learn how to make the best use of all of the characters. It forces you to experiment, to go to the strange green ghost lady in the crystal ball and ask for a practice match. Yes, you heard me correctly. And figure out different team combinations that work for you and aren't all reliant on the same handful of players. Complementing this is the fact that exiles need a certain amount of enlightenment, this game's version of XP, to be eligible for their freedom. So you can't free a character unless you've used them a lot. And when you put all of that together, what you end up with is a campaign that is really very clever about encouraging you to use all of the characters. And for as much as I've ragged on the rest of the campaign, that is some great design backed up by good writing. In fact, it's so good that the game itself makes a point of bragging about it. I guess this was a part that they really wanted people to talk about, and either they were terrified we wouldn't get it, or this is a display of self-congratulation worthy of Stephen Moffat. But as much as that nearly put me off talking about it, it doesn't detract from the fact that it's a good idea worth experiencing. And I can understand people being put off by the idea of having to invest so much time in the game just to get to that point, especially given you've got to wade through so many stock high fantasy subplots along the way. But those moments aside, numerous though they may be, I think the majority of players will find that the campaign does have enough going for it to keep them interested. Between the brilliant and inventive gameplay, the gorgeous visuals, the awesome soundtrack, this guy, let's not forget, and a sarcastic, disembodied commentator whose voice actor absolutely nails every line that comes out of his mouth, even though some of his lines did sound slightly dubious.
The bog-crone Bertrude shows herself in full.
So that's Pyre. A brilliant game eventually. A very good investment of time provided you've got enough of it to spare. Definitely deserves all the positive attention it's been getting, but its initially alien gameplay and its initially bog-standard story means it's probably going to take you a while to see what all the fuss is about. But while if you're not already into your high fantasy, this game probably won't change your mind, I can still say without a shadow of a doubt that Pyre deserves to be remembered. Because the truth is, I've never really liked doing content where it's just me talking. And in fact that has made the process of making this video somewhat excruciating. So if I'm willing to push past that to create a 20-minute video on one game, that game is probably doing something that's worth a look. Just give it a minute to get going, yeah? Anyway, just thought that was worth mentioning.
Now you understand. Or do you? This was but a glimpse of that which lies ahead. I would tell you to turn back, cast down your hope. But all those such as you never listen. A celestial orb